Okay, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here with Parisa Noble. We go live every Wednesday morning U.S. time on YouTube and your preferred platform of choice, or your preferred podcast platform of choice, I should say. If you listen on Google or Spotify, Apple Music, Apple Podcast, any of those, you can find us there every Wednesday. So check us out and subscribe if you haven't already. And please share this podcast with your colleagues and friends. We'd love to get the word out as we are still a relatively young and new podcast, so we'd love to get more people to listen in on this content. So we're going to cut over to an interview now, as I mentioned before the break, with Wayne Holtham. He is the vice president of our Asia Pacific office, and not only does he lead up our Asia Pacific presence and our team in that region, but he's a very smart guy, like a lot of our team is. And he has a lot to talk about as it relates to operating models in this particular segment. And so we're going to talk with Wayne. I start off the segment in the first 20 or 30 minutes just asking him a bunch of questions on my own, and then suddenly the avalanche of questions started pouring in from the audience. So it's a really good conversation. I actually really enjoyed it. It's one of the best ones I think I've done in several months, I'd say, just in terms of the discussion and where it went. So this is going to be particularly important for those of you that are going through transformations and struggling with the question of how do we define our future state? You know, what do we want to be when we grow up, and how do we translate that into our transformation? A lot of companies struggle with that. A lot of organizations struggle. So that was the purpose of the conversation. So I'm going to cut over to Wayne, and we will take the conversation from there. So Wayne, thanks for joining the show today.
Thanks, Eric. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So actually, while we're getting set up here, I'm actually going to make sure I'm live on all the streams here. So we'll maybe while we're getting started here, maybe just give us a little bit of background of some of your background and kind of how you came up in the world of digital and business transformation, and ultimately what we'll talk about here in a minute, which is business operating models and business process type stuff. But maybe just give us a quick overview in the meantime.
Okay, Eric. Yeah, I've been around, I suppose, for the last 30, 40 years in functional as well as so in the days before we had computers, and since then got to the point probably about 15 years ago into digital transformation, when it really got into the point where the basis of cloud was taking off. We had ERP platforms becoming the norm for major organizations. So working in the delivery of those major platforms, and digital transformation has probably taken off a lot more, because where we had an on-premise type instance in the past, now we have a lot more modules that we actually like to work together, and that just makes everything a bit more complex. So that's, I've sort of grown into that space, and from delivery as well as a functional role. So you get to see both sides of what happens when it comes to operating a platform.
Great. So you've been doing this a while, and you've seen a lot of different a lot of different situations and types of transformations through the years, I suspect.
Yeah, and with a lot of different industries, whether it be manufacturing, whether it be mining, whether it be utilities, whether it be retail, everybody has a different sort of need, and that's why our topic today will be really good, because it sort of highlights that if you put some thinking in at the start, you can actually keep that secret sauce that got your business to where it needs to be, or where it started to actually be an advantage for you.
Yeah, great. Well, good. Well, before I dive into the questions here, I just want to welcome our audience too. We're live streaming right now on Crowdcast, where many of you are watching. I know we've got several people watching so far on LinkedIn, as well as YouTube and Facebook. So we're streaming on a few different platforms here. And the whole idea of this weekly Friday, or in your case, Wayne, or others in Asia Pacific, I guess it's Saturday already, but this Friday/Saturday standing time that we have for these live streams is really to record our Transformation Ground Control primary interviews in a live setting. So we want to get more audience participation, and you're actually getting sort of behind the scenes of the podcast production here, because you get to be part of the show, and then we'll kind of wrap this up and put it through production and polish it up and all that good stuff, and put it out here in a couple of weeks as one of our episodes of Transformation Ground Control. So I appreciate the audience being here today. Encourage you to jump in anytime, add a question in the chat. If you're on LinkedIn, feel free to include a chat there, or on YouTube or Crowdcast, even Facebook. I'm watching all the platforms here. So as Wayne is answering my starting point questions, I'll keep an eye to see what questions you all might have. So to start, Wayne, maybe just the topic today is business operating model. Maybe just help us unpack what is that? What exactly is an operating model, and how does it fit into a digital transformation?
Well, it's interesting. Operating model, there's a number of different levels of operating models. So if I'm a major corporate organization, I'm looking at whether I'm decentralized, I'm centralized, and your normal consulting firms will come in and give you some advice on how you should structure your organization, whether it be globally or whether it be within a particular region. But the operating model we're talking about today is about how we actually how we operate our technology. So we buy in a traditional ERP, we'll have the basics of ERP, but then we're actually looking for different modules. And so that helps us drive what our business operating model should look like, and then how we can leverage the technology to make that work for us. And so that's probably the different levels that we talk about with operating. And then obviously that leads into a number of different impacts to the business when it comes to how we operate. So are all our processes right? Are we doing things in a consistent way? Are there certain impacts that happen to us, like we might need investment to do a lot of projects, but we don't actually plan for that investment. So let's put in an operating model that supports that. So these are the sort of things to consider.
Okay. So if I hear you right, it sounds like an operating model is sort of like business process management or business process improvement. How does it or doesn't it relate to process management or process improvement? How does it all tie together?
Well, it influences it, and that's the key thing. So it's sort of, if you've got the overarching, I suppose, platform of the operating model, then the processes that come under that actually is what drives you as such. So if I'm doing, like I say, investment planning, then I want to be able to have a few processes that inform me where I should invest or how I should invest, what I should invest. And so that drives some of those processes of how do I get that information? So I need to be able to get, it's almost like a circular process. So I'm going to invest here. How do I invest? How do I deliver? How do I know I've delivered that on time? And so that's the sort of operating model that we talk about when we talk about that capital investment project type thing.
Gotcha. Okay. And when we think about the operating model and business processes in general, how does it fit into an overall transformation? You talked about end-to-end processes and how technology can help you define that future state operating model, but how does it all tie together? Or how does it, as far as sequencing and timing and all that stuff, how do you integrate this into your digital transformation?
Well, the operating model is one of those things you should think about at the beginning, because what it will do is actually say, well, what is the architecture we're actually going to have, the functional architecture of the modules. So for our digital transformation, we're going to have a grouping of modules that actually that we'll buy or we'll actually look to actually implement. And so that then those modules will then need to be defined on how we're going to have processes that support those modules or leverage those modules. And so the first stage is usually identify the operating model, then look at your architecture. So what's your bill of materials, what's your makeup of your platform going to look like, and then obviously the processes that actually drive and leverage that. And so that's where process improvement comes in, because often organizations work in the silo, so they'll work within their particular disciplines. What this is trying to drive is that they leverage off each other. So if I'm finance, I'm a supporter of getting better outcomes. So planning my investment, planning those sorts of things. Whereas in the past, finance was more just a transactional. So it helps them become that piece of the organization that manages efficiency across the organization, which is a big process as such.
Right. So it sounds like from what you're describing that this whole concept of operating model is sort of a centerpiece for any sort of transformation, whether it's a digital transformation or even just a general business transformation, where it's sort of driven by your operating model if you do it right, or if you do it the way that you're suggesting, and that sort of leads to other things. You figure out the architecture, as you mentioned, what architecture is best going to support that operating model, what technology, how does that affect the organization, the change management or the change impact, performance measures. It's sort of touching all those things, isn't it?
Oh, exactly right. And it's interesting when you actually deliver one of these programs, and I'm 2/3 the way through working with an organization to deliver a program, and I didn't come in at the start, so they didn't have an operating model. And so their selection was, we're going to get a whole heap of technology. We're going to make it like we had before. And now they've actually got this technology in. They're realizing the gap in what they've done is because the operating model doesn't support all of this other functionality. And so they're actually putting themselves backwards because they still have the problem of not being able to manage their capital investment. They still have the problem where people do things differently. So there's nothing that actually guides or sits umbrellas the digital technology that they've purchased. So they've just bought a whole heap of technology that'll fix it, and it doesn't, because it doesn't bring it together. There's nothing holding the processes or the actual architects. They can't even get out of design. So it's a real you can see the challenge of not having those sorts of steps done at the beginning.
Yeah. And I know you and I have worked on projects together and independently of one another, even before working together on the Third Stage team. And one of the things that I know we've seen, on clients together, and I suspect you may have seen this in your past too, is that you get so enamored by technology oftentimes that the technology becomes the centerpiece instead of the operating model. And so that, that subtle nuance sort of changes the focus. I mean, what would you say to someone who's saying, well, why would we worry about our operating model? We're just going to go find, SAP or Oracle, implement that, and then that'll sort of determine what our operating model is. How would you respond to that objection or that thought?
Well, it's interesting. I had the same question asked of me yesterday from a client. It's one of those things where it's trying to help them understand because they have challenges, they have pain points. And so the reason they're putting technology in usually is to overcome those challenges. And it's misguided in a sense because the vendors sort of say, well, yeah, technology will fix it all. But what is quite important to recognize is the reason those pain points are there is because it's more about process and how they operate. Technology is just a component of that. And so when we start talking about how we would address and overcome some of those pain points, like lack of capital, money, running out of operational expenditure, running out of those sorts of things, you start to tie it back and say, well, you could actually improve what you do just by the way you operate. And the technology is only going to support that. It's not going to be the complete answer to that. And so it's an interesting discussion because it's hard to get your head around, because many people think operating model, well, I'm centralized, I'm decentralized. As many of the big consulting firms come in and believe that operating model is for you. It's, that second level is where, how are we going to operate? Now we've grown, context has changed. There's disruptors that have happened in our world. Is our operating model still the same as what it has been in the past? And that's why you need to consider those things up front, because your context has changed. And so technology is only going to either enhance that or cause you some more issues.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. So on the, I guess on that, along those lines with does the technology drive the business operating model, or does the operating model drive the technology? Is that true in most cases that you see that is best practice? Would you consider that best practice to sort of define your operating model first, or does it depend on the client, or how would you determine the right approach there?
Your operating model depends on the client and the type of industry you're in and the type of organization you are. Technology is really it should only support it and influence, the operating model should influence what technology is and how you use that technology. So to try and put technology first to actually create your operating model, and it's interesting that many people talk about best of breed or the leveraging technology best of breed. Well, that just makes me the same as everybody else. And so if I was an organization that wanted to be more competitive, a leader in my market, and I was best of breed, then I'm only as good as what technology is telling me to be. Whereas the operating model leverages how I can actually be the best I can be within my industry as such. We can do things in certain ways that give us, and I think the American version of that is what they call secret sauce. It's that competitive advantage that many people are looking to have in a really, really, it's a competitive world we're in, sort of thing. And so if we don't consider how we operate different than just having technology that is the same as everybody else's, then we're not getting any advantage. It's like when we play a sport, every team within that particular discipline actually plays a sport, but only a few are premiers or win the Super Bowl at the end, sort of thing. And so, why is that the case? Is they play the game better, so their operating model is actually more refined than everybody else, because they play by the same rules. The rules are actually no one plays different rules. It's just they learn how to play them better. And I suppose that's the best analogy I find with getting a very good operating model in place is look at a sporting team. There's not a lot of differences that they have apart from players and how you play the game. Not necessarily, the rules. Rules is like the technology. That's the bit that's I suppose the leveler for everyone.
Yeah, that's a great analogy and a really good point that ties it back to, success and failure rates in the industry. I mean, so many of these transformations fail largely because people are doing things out of order. They don't have the right strategy. They don't have the right approach to deploy the technology. It's usually not because the technology doesn't work or the technology is broken. It's usually because we haven't managed this whole concept of, what we want to be when we grow up and letting that dictate how we run our project versus I'm going to go buy SAP, Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, whatever the product is, and I'm going to defer to that product and let that determine for me what processes or best practices are most appropriate for me. And I think that difference oftentimes can separate, in your analogy, the winners versus the losers in transformation, success versus failure.
Exactly right. And it's one of those things when you see organizations that are really understanding of an operating model or their place in their industry, you see the success they have and the way they actually approach things. When you look at organizations that think, I'll get the silver bullet or the magic pill or whatever, which is technology, and they get lost in it because what vendors sell people isn't actually the complete picture, because technology is only a component. It's a feeder. If you don't have processes, if you don't have understanding of how you actually are going to use those processes, if you don't have architecture that actually supports that, then you've really just got technology. That's it, which it can be limiting in the way you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you hit a really important point that I think is worth maybe highlighting a little bit, which is that if you're a customer, if you're a CIO or CFO or any sort of part of any organization that's about to go through a digital transformation, and you go talk to software vendors, generally they're going to tell you, if you were to present this concept to them, like, hey, we're going to define our operating model first, then we're going to bring in the technology to support that. What I've found, and I'm curious to see if you agree with this, is most of the time vendors will say, no, don't worry about the operating model. Our software has best practices, it's pre-configured for your industry, and that's just a waste of time to do that operating model stuff or that future state definition. Let our software do that for you. I mean, how do that it sounds good. I mean, it sounds like that's what I would love to hear, or I'd love that to be true, because that would make life so much easier for everyone if the technology could just sort of figure it out for us. But I found that to not be the case. What's your experience been?
Oh, exactly right. The vendors come in, and I think it's just a ploy to say, well, if I can make you feel at ease that what you're putting in is going to solve all of those problems, then you won't go and look anywhere else, or you won't actually maybe look at a different software because you realize that the software we're offering may not deliver everything that you're looking for. And I think they get a bit scared on that. And so they're very good at convincing people that, don't worry, we've got all of the answers you need. And we've actually got, in our particular offering, we actually have a version that suits your industry, and it's best of breed. And that whole vision of best of breed is often overstated, because what is best of breed? As I said, is that just the leveler that everybody wants to work off? I've worked in probably thousands of businesses, and I've never seen every business work the same way. So how could best of breed work for a competitive business? So maybe a government instrumentation, sort of thing, where they're actually working, following government rules or whatever, but even they work differently across different regions, across different parts of the world, globally. So how can you have one technology platform say, I'm best of breed, and all of your problems will be solved? It's a bit hard to, when you step back, it's only when you step back you can see that. But many times when you're in the spotlight of the vendor, offering you and really sort of putting up some benchmarks, and you start looking at, the magic quadrants and those sort of things, and they sort of lead you to believe that everybody's heading towards this best of breed, when really that's just not really the case. It just means that people are actually putting in certain platforms, but they're still configuring, and they still need to configure them in a certain way that actually satisfies their business as such.
Yeah, great points. And I always try to empathize with the situation and understand the dynamics at play in any sort of situation like that. And I always look at, what if I were a software vendor sales rep? What would I be telling people, or why would a sales rep say those sorts of things? And you have to look at what their incentives are. Their incentive is to sell you on their software as quickly as possible. And if you start focusing on operating model and stuff that sort of gives you a blueprint for how to deploy technology, or if it creates any sort of doubt that technology is going to be the right answer for you, obviously I'm going to try to override that to try to sell you, like, why don't you just sign the contract now? Let's just get our software in there, and then I'll make my commission and you can go implement it. Well, I'll be happy, right? I mean, it's sort of the human dynamic or human behavior at play. And so you just have to recognize it for what it is and say, well, let's look at what's best for our business. And I think your point is really well taken too. The point about, if every system, if there were systems out there that had best of breed or best practices, whatever you want to call it, then what advantage would any organization have over another organization? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, it seems like you alluded to this a little bit in your last response, but it seems like you have sort of two subsets of business processes. You have your commodity processes, like your accounts payable and GL, your period end close processes, things that they're not the same across organizations, but you could probably live with whatever technology can or can't do, or, and I'm generalizing here, but in general, those processes are more commoditized and a little bit more vanilla. But when you look at things that are more specific to your customers or your product, or if you're a, engineer to order complex product, there's probably processes that are unique to you that give you some sort of edge, or that could give you some sort of edge that you want to define up front and then figure out how the technology fits. So have you seen that work before, where you sort of bifurcate or separate into two buckets, the vanilla processes, and maybe you don't spend as much time defining the operating model, and then over here with these competitive advantage or secret sauce processes, you go deeper into those areas?
Yeah, it's a good point you raised there, because it's I've probably, as you talk through that, it's like I've generalized, but there are best of breed in the sense of everybody creates an invoice, everybody creates a accounts payable process. So those sort of things you can say, well, they are standardized processes, and the more streamlined they are and the more simple they are, then that's what you're trying to get, because obviously that adds to additional transaction costs, which is internal costs within the business. But the other processes you talk about, those ones that are competitive advantage ones, they're the ones that you want to be able to have control of. So it is almost two different focuses on it. So one is the commodity type ones, your accounts payable, your finance, your traditional type things that, there is a lot of consistency and a lot of standardization in that, which I think is helpful that organizations consider that, because many organizations complicate that part of it. And so you can see where processes are very important, in the sense that if I streamline that, I actually bring more time available back in my organization to do the things I need to do for the people who are doing those roles, instead of fighting fires. But the other part is looking at, how do I actually improve processes that actually really add value to my business? And I suppose that's that secret sauce piece. So it's about understanding that both are important, and both actually add value to your business. So taking complexity out is important, but the other piece is leveraging how you go about what you do and how you do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to continue the conversation with Wayne, talking about operating models. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after this quick break.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. I'm here chatting with Wayne Holtham, and we're going to cut back to the interview here. We're talking about operating models within transformation. So take it away, Wayne. So I'm going to come back to that thread here in a minute, but in the meantime, we've gotten a few questions and comments that from the audience here. I'm checking, looks like LinkedIn and Crowdcast here. We have a few comments. So I'll start with Crowdcast here, and I think you can see this probably on your screen, Wayne. But Saif Chowdhury made an observation. As per my experience, clients like to seek the vendor that provides pre-configured processes that can be then used as a starting point for workshops to tweak. And that's an interesting point, or an interesting question, or an interesting topic to maybe unpack a little bit. What about that concept of, hey, okay, fine, you want to, Mr. or Mrs. Client, you want to implement, or you want to define your operating model. Let's have us come in, the software vendor or system integrator. We'll come in and we'll guide those workshops based on best practice, and then you could tweak those best practices to fit your operating model, your desired future state. Is that how does that work? Is that a good approach? Is it a watered down approach of what you're suggesting, or what do you think?
Well, I usually find it ends up being a slanted towards technology approach, because what they're trying to lead you to do is say, well, and they're very well versed in it. So if they start talking about certain processes, say, you'll need this extra piece of technology to be able to make that happen. And so it ends up being an additional aspect to the sales process, instead of saying, what do I really need? And many times you find that when you've had a vendor drive that, you end up with a lot of shelfware later, because what they actually sold you really doesn't work to actually satisfy. When you get down into the detail, you go, that doesn't work for us. Bad luck, I've already bought that, so that will sit there. And so that's one of the challenges when you have the vendor driving that, because there's no objectivity. And when you look at what they do, is they don't know your business. They have never worked in your industry. And so how would they actually have the specialist depth of how it operates to be able to make the technology work? So they really only come in from that side, is the technology side.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it seems especially true for, call it the bigger ERP systems. So like the SAP S/4HANAs of the world, the Oracle ERP Cloud, Microsoft Dynamics 365, those big ERP systems, generally you're more likely to run into issues or situations where the technology just doesn't do what you need it or want it to do. But in those workshops, to your point, they'll say, okay, well, let's figure out a workaround, or here's an alternative. And that's okay, but oftentimes it gets really watered down, and it's just a limitation of the technology, or you're sort of boxing yourself in, you're sort of compromising what you really want and need out of your operating model when you take that approach. And maybe there's parts, like if you're doing an S/4HANA implementation, maybe there's parts of your organization that shouldn't be using S/4HANA. That's not a terrible thing to admit and say, well, maybe we shouldn't use S/4HANA for CRM. Maybe we should go use Salesforce. Maybe Salesforce is a better fit. So to your point, yeah, you don't want to get sucked into saying, okay, well, we'll just buy the whole product for across the enterprise without really knowing what our future state operating model is, because you're probably going to end up with some parts of the business that just don't function well.
Yeah, and what they tend to do is actually blindside you to actually what other options are there. So like you say, Salesforce or something else might actually be a better fit. But you will never get that if you've actually invited the vendor in to actually do those early workshops, because as far as they're concerned, there is nothing else in the world apart from their particular piece of software. And so it's not until later that you actually realize, geez, if only I'd done this. But you're with an ERP for how many years? On average, 15 years is the time you're with an ERP platform. So it's not something you're going to change straight away. You're just stuck with it, and that's a real problem, because if you're putting something in, you don't want to be something that holds you back after you've deployed. You want to be able to really get that value back out of that huge spend that you've just gone through.
Yeah, absolutely. Get that ROI that you're looking for. Mm-hmm. So a couple other comments, actually. Here's a couple things from LinkedIn here. There's one person, Jeff Weber, says operating model is the horse and technology is the cart, which that's a maybe even simpler analogy than the sports analogy you used earlier. And I like that. It's which comes first, the horse or the cart. Mm-hmm. And then a question here from Rajendra Singh Negi. I may have butchered your last name or all of your name. I apologize for that. His question is, get data about organization and processes. Tech could help, which leads to the operating model. Get technology to help. I'm not 100% sure what he's asking here, but it sounds like he's asking or maybe making a comment that technology supports the operating model, and it helps the business model versus being driven by technology, or driving the operating model. It sounds like is what he might be alluding to there.
I think one of the things there with technology determining your operating model, there are some tools out there that actually will help you actually understand how you operate as such. And so there is some technology that will help guide you with that. But it's not what your ERP platform or CRM or HCM technology is. It's you finding the gaps within it to actually guide how you should operate. So it is an informer as such if you use the technology in that way, but we're talking different technologies. And so one is a understanding and insight and allows you to be able to monitor that you are maintaining your operating model and the procedures that sit underneath that, processes sit underneath that. So that technology is there in place. And I think it's probably becoming more mainstream as people look at that, to actually guide them on the bigger piece of their journey is the larger implementation of an ERP, a CRM, whatever that might end up being. So yes, there is some technology that can help you understand how you are operating, so to give you a bit of insight. So it's just not a guess as such.
Yeah, and actually I want to come back to that point. I have an article I was going to refer to in a question I'm going to ask you here in a second. So hold that thought, because that's a really interesting one. Here's a comment here on Crowdcast, or a question from Sam Graham, and I had a chance to read this question while you were responding to the last one. I really like this question, and it's something that has been a theme with other interviews I've conducted recently in our podcast for or with past clients and current clients. But the comment is, or the question/comment is, when I've worked with Japanese companies, and by the way, this is, if I didn't mention, this is from Sam Graham. When I've worked with Japanese companies, I've noticed that when they launch into a project, they spend a lot of time thinking about what they are going to do and then not much time doing it. In the West, companies spend as little time as possible planning and then much more time actually doing. That suggests that they believe that the silver bullet exists and that they can solve all their problems by buying into best practice. Should software vendors define best practice is the question. And he might have other responses to the rest of his comment as well.
Well, I think it actually sums it up well in the sense that if you put the planning in at the beginning and you have the understanding of what you actually want, when the questions are asked by the solution integrator or the vendor, what do you want from us, sort of thing, you actually are very, very clear on that. Whereas what happens normally is there's this process in the West where, we do heaps of workshops, we identify all of the pain points we have, which is the past as such. But then we go, oh, well, technology will fix that. But we don't actually put the link together on how it's going to fix it or what it's going to mean. And so, whereas I think the Japanese put a lot more of that planning in at the start and say, well, we need to get down into the detail. And then when we roll it out, there's a much better chance. It's far quicker. It's less disruption because we've got on that journey, we've actually a lot of people understanding what we're doing. Whereas from the Western side, it's about we do all of these other workshops. And then it's not until people actually get the system and go, that's not really what we wanted, sort of thing. And so, because they weren't brought along that journey. And I think that's a very good point you raised there about early planning, understanding what you want, knowing your requirements, and getting the solution integrator and the vendors to deliver that to you, not ask them what it needs to be, because they'll only deliver you what they think you need, which, there's a gap.
Right. Yeah. And just to build on your point and Sam's point, I recently spoke with and interviewed on this podcast, actually, a client who's the CFO at a client out of our European office is where we were working with this client. And he had commented on the fact that they were part of a carve out. So his organization was spun off from a parent company, and they had, I think it was 12 months to stand up a new ERP system because they had to get off the old one within 12 months and be self-sufficient. So they were under a pretty significant time crunch. And so I was asking him, how did you meet that time frame? Because that's pretty aggressive and you're sort of under the gun. Most organizations aren't quite under that much pressure. They might be under some more other pressure. So I asked him, what was the key to getting it done and that quickly? And he said, spending time planning. It was all about the planning we did up front. And then I said, well, how long of those 12 months did you spend planning versus actual execution of the transformation? And he said he wasn't exactly sure, but he said it was about 60%. So I said, so over 6 months. He said, yeah, it was definitely over 6 months of the 12 months that we had to implement. We spent planning. And I think, to Sam's point, one of the big challenges or problems you have, if you hear 12 months, you think, oh, we better start doing stuff. Let's get a vendor in here. Let's just start doing workshops. Let's start configuring, designing and configuring. But that just leads you, it may feel like you're going faster, but you're just creating a bunch of problems that are going to add to your time frame later on.
Oh, that's right. And when you actually ask the vendor, they'll give you a response, and then you get the response back. You go, "Oh, I'm not sure what that actually means." And so then you spend time trying to work out what it actually means, and so that time just keeps slipping and slipping away. Whereas if you're really clear on what you've done and what you're deciding up front, then the responses back to the vendor from the vendor or the solution integrator are very clear. And so all of a sudden you go, yep, I can act on that. I can make a decision. I don't need to, clarification becomes less. And so the planning ends up leading you along the journey faster. And like you say, you can spend a lot of time thinking you're doing something because you're asking questions. But really, if you're not getting the answers and you're just constantly in that circle of trying to get understanding, then you're just wasting time.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. One question here, I'm trying to think of what order to go in here just to keep a flow, but one question we had here that I think you alluded to a little bit early in the conversation, but maybe it's worth rehashing, especially for people that are joining mid-conversation here. But Shalita Amarin asked the question on LinkedIn, what is included in the operating model? So when you define operating model, just what is included within that?
That's a good question. So in an operating model, you need to be able to have what the governance is of the organization, what the I suppose the competitive driver of the organization is, how you're actually going to measure performance should be part of your operating model, what drives performance, and obviously then the processes that are going to lead you to deliver that performance. So there's those areas that you consider when you're developing that operating model.
Gotcha. Okay. And then actually we had a first question come in on YouTube here. And that question is from Romeo from London. He asks, what is your opinion on senior management interference in dictating project budgets and deadline without a proper understanding of project processes? Maybe I'll just add to that, maybe a sort of a sub question there is, how do you leverage the operating model to help you define what that, what that time, duration, and cost might be?
It's interesting because when you actually start looking at the operating model, you start to realize the impact to the business that this transformation is going to be. Many times you have executives feel as if they've got a number in mind, and it's really difficult because you have software vendors come in and they say, we'll give you a benchmark price on what it would actually cost to implement this software. And what you find is many times that price is to be able to it's the test the water price. Is that how much money you actually have? But they don't really want to make it so that it really seems overwhelming. And so for them, they actually say, well, we know that this price will probably get us across the line. And so that cements it in the executive's mind, which puts pressure on the project then because not everything's considered. They don't consider the level of change that's involved. They don't consider the amount of disruption to the organization. They don't consider all of those other sort of things, which become a pressure on a project later on if it hasn't been considered. And so, and sometimes if you're just tweaking your operating model, the change to your business isn't as much. So you don't need to factor in that. But vendor is not going to know that. And so they usually go with, what's a price that I think I can actually get this across the line? It's the sales process. When I'm buying a car, I don't tell someone the recommended price. I try and get out of them how much they want to spend, and then can we fit in there? And that's usually how it works.
Right. And then there's actually a follow-up question from Romeo from London, and we'll just kind of keep going with this thread since it's relevant to what you just said. So his follow-up question is, do you think that senior management should be trained in project management processes? So it's sort of related to that. I think it's about expectation setting and educating senior management is what his question is related to there.
I think that the senior management is there for a particular. If we train them to be project managers, then I think that'd be even worse of a problem. I think the thing is they need to be able to understand the objectivity. It's about educating them and asking them the right questions so that the decisions they're making end up working with delivering a platform not delivering what a vendor has sold them as such. And I think that's the disconnect. Process management practices should be very clear, and if we follow them appropriately and properly, we end up where we get a good outcome. I think the challenge we have is that if people don't understand what the project is, when those big decisions are made, you find that they're actually contradicting or holding you back when you're actually trying to implement a project. And that's where the challenge in project management comes. You can't get decisions when you need them. You're constantly then asking for position papers, which is losing time. And for a project manager, if I've got a set timeline, I don't want delays. And so these are some of these things that hold up a project, because the senior executive really isn't understanding of what they're actually doing as such. They're not being presented with information to make decisions as they need to make them. And so there is an education piece for senior executives to understand what it takes to deliver one of these programs. I think we run a boot camp to be able to onboard executives for that very reason. So they really understand these questions are going to be posed to you. And so are you ready to be able to answer those? Because when they come, they're going to come, and you need to answer, move on, and that keeps the project rolling.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So a commenting question here from Kiran Patel on Crowdcast. He says, it seems the Japanese way has advantages in planning ahead. What is the typical time it takes to plan business processes before engaging a vendor?
It's interesting. If you've been involved with process mapping over the times, there is times when they can take many months and many years. And organizations I've walked into, you ask the question, they say, yeah, we've mapped our processes and we understand them completely, and we've got 5 different versions of them over the time. So sometimes we get caught up in the fact of not really mapping process. We try and predict what as is. And one of probably the greatest advances in technology that's happened lately is the fact that we can actually now start to see what is. It's a big difference in the sense that many times we'll sit in a workshop where people will put a lot of post-it notes on the wall and go, we do this process. But if you were to talk to someone actually down on the shop floor, they would go, well, we don't actually do that process because it doesn't work. So we have a workaround about that. And that's not evident. And so it's about now leveraging what do people actually do. And there's some tools that allow you to be able to do that quickly, as against the old way of doing it, where we're actually putting, we're asking people because people will only tell you what they want to hear. And are we asking the right people what's actually happening? So middle managers are the ones who are probably least informed about what's actually happening in organization when it comes to some of those basic processes.
Right. Yeah. And then a follow-up question, or part 2 of Karan's question here is, what high-level step is recommended based on experience if it was a Microsoft Dynamics implementation, for example, I think he's asking about sort of building on that previous question about planning the business processes or the operating model prior to engaging a vendor. What is that, what are those high-level steps that someone should take to get to that point where you're actually leveraging or engaging with the senior or with the software vendor?
I think if you get your operating model right, then I look at functional architecture. So what does that operating model do? What modules am I going to need to be able to do that? If I'm in an industry where, and lots of times now we're expecting more parts of the organization to interact with the system. And so we have mobility devices now, we have those sorts of things. Whereas in the past, we came in with a piece of paper or some information and someone typed it into the system, and that's how we operated. We now have many more people getting information back into our system, whether it be through mobility, whether it be through portals, customer portals, all those sorts of things. And so we need to then understand, well, what software are we going to need to actually deliver that for us, and how are we going to get consistency of how that is actually, we capture the data. So we want to be able to make sure that information we get is consistent and actually doesn't cause us more problems. And so though the functional architecture is probably the next piece to deliver it, and then by then you should be able to go to the vendor and start to get an idea of what they have available and how they could actually satisfy those scenarios that you're actually looking to satisfy.
Yeah. Very good. Well, I'm going to open a can of worms here to warn you here, or I'm not, which I don't shoot the messenger, Wayne. I'm just asking the question that the audience is asking here. But I think this is a good topic here, or a good thread. So this is from Rashid on YouTube is asking a question here. He's basically asking the question about the planning that we talked about, spending 60% in the example I gave about spending all this time up front with planning. And he says, but most customers want Agile and 15-day releases. What do you think about clients who want Agile and Scrum implementations and sprint releases? So how does this all, and this is a great topic. I love this question because it is sort of a balancing act or a challenge that a tightrope you have to balance out in these implementations. What about Agile and Scrum and that whole sprint mentality? How does that fit into this whole operating model concept?
That ends up being in the delivery approach and how you select and deliver your platform. I suppose, I hope I don't want to upset anybody, but Agile, if you look at what Agile is, Agile was set up to actually develop software. And so you end up with a very clear objective of what you're looking to do for a defined piece of development as such. Whereas when we apply that to a very complex digital transformation, there are many, many pieces that Agile struggle to do, because if we try to roll out things quickly, what we do is we end up doing lots of pieces, but we end up with what I call an air gap. So the air gap between them. So we have lots of pieces that don't actually fit together because they don't follow that flow of, we need to get to this point, but we've got so many extra complexity things feeding it that we miss things along the way. And so that's where Agile really struggles in the complex. There's a lot of people who say, the Scrums work really well, and there's a whole lot of technology out there that's meant to do it. I'm just been involved in a massive project, and it's gone down the Agile route. And I think it probably adds an extra 30% of cost onto your organization, because by the time you get to the end where you're starting to go, I need to close design, I need to make sure my processes are in place. I need to understand what changes I've made. All of a sudden, you get a lot of those gotcha moments. We didn't consider that. We forgot that. We missed that. And they're the sort of things that extend timelines. And not to say that they may have just delivered Agile or managed the Agile process poorly. That could be the case. But I still see that gap happens when people apply Agile in its rawest form. I think it needs to be a bit of a hybrid. We've got a waterfall approach where things do cascade, and it probably keeps us online in some ways. But the Agile piece, it is parcels of work we could do to actually, satisfy the requirements. So it really does need to be not just a straight Agile for the sake of we're just Agile.
Yeah, and I think it's well put that you can have that hybrid approach. You can spend that time up front defining your operating model and have a very clear blueprint vision for how you're going to deploy technology and deploy the changes through the organization. But then you could go to the sprint mentality in terms of how you execute. But when you start off with that sprint mentality, I find that oftentimes, yes, we're sprinting, but we're going in the total wrong direction here. We should be going this other way. And so we're sprinting the wrong way. So good news, we're going fast. Bad news, we're going the wrong direction. So I think that dynamic longer term will cost you more than the intent of sprint, or the intent of Agile was meant to be. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue and wrap up this conversation with Wayne. We'll take more audience questions. We have a lot more audience questions we're going to get to as it relates to operating models, and we actually talk about a lot of other stuff in that context too. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back on Transformation Ground Control.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
back to Transformation Ground Control. We're going to finish up the interview with Wayne and talk more about operating models and take more questions from the audience. So we'll cut back to the interview right here. So we're getting a bunch of questions here on LinkedIn, actually. So I'll pull a couple here. One of it's more of a comment, I believe, and see if you have a response to this, Wayne, but this is from Evan Bombeki on LinkedIn. And he says, Romeo's question seems directly related to one of the approaches to mitigating IT implementation risk, according to APIX, performing due diligence on proposals by interviewing previous purchasers and using third-party evaluators. And I forgot, so Romeo was the one that was asking the questions about, I forgot which ones he was asking. So he's referring to Romeo's question. I apologize, I don't remember which one was Romeo's. But what are your thoughts here on mitigating implementation risk by performing due diligence on proposals, by interviewing previous purchasers or previous customers and using third-party evaluators?
I think that's a great option, because how do you actually get that independence? How do you actually get what is real? And it's interesting. I recently did a survey of a number of organizations that have implemented S/4HANA over the last probably 2 to 3 years. And when you actually have been through the process where the vendors are trying to sell you S/4HANA, and they talk about its level, its maturity, it's all those sort of things, and then you talk to the people who've actually implemented and the gaps that were involved in that, I think it's a really helpful process to actually have that ability to be able to have that insight when you go in, because your discussion with the vendor becomes a bit of a different discussion. It's how we're going to work to overcome these challenges. Not to say you're not going to buy it, but how we're going to overcome these challenges that we recognize are there, as against, no, they were never there until you actually have bought it, and then they're there, sort of thing. So, and that independent piece is ask those questions that most it's interesting, because organizations get caught in the sales thing of, well, we don't really ask them that because that might make us seem, like we don't know what we're doing, or those sort of things. Whereas an independent, truly independent organization will actually ask those questions that makes the vendor squirm, because that's what they should be doing. They should be actually being honest and genuine and being able to say, well, we would deal with it this way, and here's how we would do that. Whereas an organization either doesn't know how to ask that question or doesn't feel comfortable in asking that question. So it's really a good piece, a good thing, practice to employ someone who can be that objective person in the middle that isn't afraid to ask those questions, has experience on what you need to do so that you actually get the best outcome.
Right. Good. It's funny because some of the people that were on Crowdcast now are on LinkedIn, so I'm getting confused because they're saying, "Oh, I was the one over on Crowdcast that asked you this. Now I'm going to ask you this over on a different platform." So I apologize if I'm missing anyone here. So what about this? What is your opinion of non-IT professionals recruiting IT-related staff like business and less product owners?
It is interesting where we actually we engage people on the fact that their price point in the marketplace is cheap enough for us to accept, not their experience level. And I often see that where we actually have recruiters come in and they will fill a project full of people because they were the people in the market, but their criteria didn't actually consider the type of platform we're putting in or the experience level of those people. They just sort of filled the recruiter's, I suppose, inbox, and so they presented those options. And when you get into a project where, and it's a classic, especially if you've got organizations that are going to say SAP that weren't SAP before, and if you've got a whole team that's actually implementing that and they have no understanding of the complexities of SAP, then what you find is that they don't understand what you need to do. And so that's where you get a bit of that half-baked type thing. So, processes are ultra important when you're doing SAP, understanding how you're doing those sort of things. When you've got other platforms that might be a bit more flexible, processes can, be close. But with SAP, you've got to be very defined, very clear on what you're doing. And so people who don't have that experience can cause a lot of problems because they just really don't understand how it operates at the end of the day, or what's the user going to have to do at the end of the day to actually make this thing work.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So another question here is from Susanna Carrion she's from Spain. So we have at least two people I know of that are from Spain here on the live stream. So apparently we have a huge following in Spain from what I can tell. But Susanna's question is, there are some ERP vendors that have such a quick approach that it's supposed to help the implementation phase, making it in a shorter timeline. All processes supported by the ERP are already mapped from the beginning. Do you think this type of approach can really help defining the operating model joined with the client or in conjunction with the client?
I think the gap there is that the notion that they could actually have them predefined to start with, because as we talk about this, it's that concept of best of breed, and so what you find, this is a challenge with some of the cloud options where they have a very defined, clear. They don't want you to change. They don't want you to customize. They want everybody to be on the same version, the same configuration, and if you've got a very simple business, that's probably okay to be able to do. But the more complex you get, the harder that is to be able to manage, because again, you will have different needs, different requirements, whether it be compliance needs, whether it be the way you operate, whether it be that secret sauce, that's going to guide that. And so where we have these out of the can type configurations, for some organizations that are very simple, yeah, that might work. But there's not a lot of those around, and I think that's the thing to recognize, is that for the limited few that they actually do satisfy, we shouldn't overshadow that and say that everyone's the same. And I think that's the problem that vendors have gotten into, because for them, it's much cheaper to actually have a software that everybody uses exactly the same way. Because when I do upgrades, when I do changes, when I do anything, it's simple for me as a software. It's my cheapest option. Anybody who wants extra costs me more, because I have to consider their needs when I'm actually rolling out upgrades and doing those sorts of things. And so it's more expensive for me as a vendor. So it's a bit of a selfish thing for the vendors. And it's probably their operating model is to actually get to the point of being as simple and as cheap, and get as many people on the same version, same platform, same configuration, because it makes sense, but not for the organization who's going to use it. That's the problem.
Right. Yeah. No, it's very true. And again, it gets back to that point of, just understanding where the vendors are coming from and what their self-interest, what self-interest might be driving the vendors, which is okay. That's their prerogative to sell you software and to do what they can to try to sell you software. But at the end of the day, you have to back up and look at your business and figure out what's best for us and figure that out first. And it's hard to do. Like you said, it's hard to do because we're all human and we don't want to let people down, or we don't want to seem like we don't know what we're doing, or if we don't have confidence in that approach, we're going to defer to, well, the vendor is the expert. They're telling us that we should just start deploying technology and, using Agile or whatever. But I think it's a matter of educating yourself too. And in fact, just to build on that, Scott Martin on Crowdcast here made a comment of related to that whole concept of Agile. He was kind of building on that thread and saying, he would ask, would you provide some details on what you mean by Agile implementation? If an executive is telling you that we should be using Agile, and then use that as an opportunity to educate the client. And I think that's really important, because I think with all the stuff we're talking about here, whether we do it the way we're recommending, or, the way a lot of organizations will do it, which is to lead with the technology and then figure out the business process stuff later, no matter which approach you take, there's always going to be risks and trade-offs. So I think it's a matter of really recognizing that none of this is a silver bullet. Even what you're saying, what I'm saying, none of this fixes everything. It gives you what we think is a better path and a path of least resistance, but it's not going to solve all the problems. There are going to be other risks along the way that need to be addressed.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you a question here around business process mining tools. Maybe we could spend a couple minutes on this. And actually, I don't know if you saw this article, Wayne, but there was an article, and I'm sorry, I don't have it in front of me. I thought I had it in front of me, and it crashed on me, or the window crashed out on me. But it was a article about an SAP implementation that I'm just going to see if I have it on my phone here, because it was a really good article. It was an article in the Register, and it was about the pharmaceutical firm GSK, and they had implemented SAP ECC, so not S/4HANA, but the legacy SAP product. They'd implemented, I think, 10 years ago, and they thought they had a common operating model. They had defined sort of a standard business process or set of business processes when they first deployed the technology, but then they used this process mining tool. I forgot which one, but they used that process mining tool to go in and eventually discovered that they had actually 28,000 variations on one single process. It was, I think, the sales order process. So they took just one micro process that they thought was being standardized, and then they used the process mining tool to see how people were actually using the system and how the processes were actually flowing, and that there's 28,000 variations. And they found that most of those didn't need to be variations. They could have been using a standard process. So I guess, first of all, what is a process mining tool? And then maybe we can come back to that point about how do you avoid that problem of this proliferation of, thousands of different variations of the same process.
Yeah, interesting discussion there, and it's great you bring this up because it's something that I've been involved in just recently and see the value of it. So a process mining tool, what it does, it actually takes a snapshot of the digital fingerprint people have when they actually go in and use the system. So as an organization, everybody, when they actually do a transaction, when they interact, they actually leave a fingerprint. And the process mining tool has an algorithm in the background that actually identifies where all those touch points were, and then it lines it with that standard process. So if you do that sales process, order to cash type process, you'll have it where, the information comes in. There'll be probably about 6 or 7 steps that actually guide that, which actually becomes what we would call a end-to-end process as such. But the challenge has been when we do process mapping, and which I was alluding to before, is that we would ask people, how do you do this? And they would give us those high level things of what we think we should do. When you overlay it with process mapping, process mining, you actually find that there are many, many hundreds of thousands of variations that people actually do. Things happen before they should do. There's reasons why, in a purchase to pay, it's interesting that you might find that where we have a purchase rec and a purchase order and, a goods receipt and an invoice, you think, oh, they're pretty simple. But then all of a sudden you're starting to get an invoice before you've actually done a purchase rec. And you go, well, we can cope with that. But then what does that mean? That means that I'm buying something that no one really, it's not even on my forecast, my radar to understand I'm going to have to pay for that. So have I forecast enough money for that? And so these are all of the challenges that we actually have. We can't actually see these unless we use something like a process mining tool. And I suppose there's a couple of recent developments when it comes to process mining tools, probably over the last 5 years. There's a couple of products that have really, and SAP has actually purchased a process mining tool that's been around for a while, and they've purchased it because that view of rolling out an ERP is complex, and they're finally getting that message. The process is a big driver of that, and understanding the gap between what good standardized process might be as against what we actually do as an organization. And that's what often derails many of these programs. There was in Queensland, we did a podcast, I think a few months ago, sort of thing, Eric, and it talked about 16 different hospitals having a centralized system rolled out, and it failed. And the reason it failed is because they had 16 hospitals doing 16 different ways that they never considered. They've actually since done a process mining exercise and realized that that was the derailer of it all, is that those hospitals just continued doing what they were doing, but no one actually took the insight of saying, well, this standardized process is what we want you to do, but no one changed. And that's so process mining is a really, really valuable tool.
Yeah. And that's, in that case, makes you wonder, was it really just 16 variations, or were there within each of the 16 locations, did they have hundreds or thousands of different variations?
Actually in the hundreds of variations for each hospital. So you multiply that and that's what happens. So yeah.
Yeah, and if you haven't heard that interview yet, I really enjoyed that interview, and I thought we covered a lot of good ground in that interview. Just check my, actually it's on the Third Stage YouTube channel. So if you go out to YouTube, just search up Third Stage and subscribe to it. Just search Queensland once you're on the channel. You'll find the interview with Wayne and I, and it's a fascinating case study, as are a lot of challenge projects, and it oftentimes leads back to business processes and process mining and all that stuff. So I think the last question I'll ask here before we wrap up, I think I've hit most of the questions. I know we didn't get to everything that the audience had, but first of all, thank you to the audience for such great questions. This was really interesting threads that we went down. But I want to make sure we cover the whole concept of change management as it relates to future state operating model. Maybe at a high level, and we could obviously spend a whole hour Q&A session just on change management, but maybe at a high level, just to give us a teaser or a flyover view, how does change management factor in or fit into this whole concept of operating model, or vice versa? How does operating model determine, our change management strategy?
it's interesting because we're working with an organization at the moment that's got this challenge. They've worked the same way for the last 20 years. And when you look at it, their industry has changed a lot. There's a whole lot of differences in the way they actually operate. There's more compliance. There's new disruptors in the market. And so all of a sudden, how we worked in the past is no longer how we can work in the future. And so change management becomes a huge part of it, because if I expect that people are going to be working the same way as they did in the past, but they don't have any guidance which the operating model's deciding for us, or we're deciding on how we're going to operate, the change management piece is taking them on that journey. So where you gave someone a piece of paper in the past to actually put information in, you're going to actually be doing it yourself on a mobility device. That's a change journey in itself. Understanding the different rules and different drivers that we actually have and we're going to be measured on is a change journey. And so that needs to be considered, and how wide that chasm is, or that gap is, for organizations from where they are today and how they operate to what this new world is going to look like, really takes, you need to work with people. You need to get people to understand. You need to get buy-in of those people to go, that makes sense. That's the reason why I want to do that, as against you must change, because how many of us humans accept you must change? And I think the change piece is often underestimated when we're talking about whole-scale digital transformation, because people need to understand why. And if we don't give them a why, they're just resistant, just the walls go up. And so it's a big area for organizations to, I think, get a handle on, which they often underestimate and think, oh, it's a cost. I can't see how I measure that value return and those sorts of things. And that's not a good way to go.
Yeah. And I think, change management is typically one of those things that is on the critical path to completion of a transformation, assuming there is a completion and not just sort of an ongoing improvement method. But in general, if you have X amount of time to implement a solution, it's change management is one of the things that will oftentimes delay if you haven't addressed it. And so one of the good things about what you're suggesting which is to bring that future state operating model work up front, is that allows you to get into the weeds sooner to determine what those impacts are going to be to the organization, so that we can develop a change strategy and start executing on a change strategy earlier, rather than waiting until we get to design and then build of the technology. By then you're so far downstream that you're playing catch up from a change management perspective. So
and usually by the time you get to that end, you're still only focusing on the technology. There's a lot more that an organization has to do apart from using the technology. And what you find is, when you're at the stage of deployment, you're teaching people how to use the new technology. Often they don't have understanding of why they're using it, what they're doing. So it's almost like you're teaching a monkey how to push a button, and that's not, and people then go, well, I really don't understand why I'm doing this. I feel more comfortable with my old way. I'll stick to that once this goes live, because no one will be watching. So, and that's usually where the challenge comes after deployment, to actually get people using the system, is because all we've taught them how to do is use a technology that they don't really understand why they're doing it, why it's built that way, or why it makes sense to do it that way. Oftentimes when we haven't thought about it, it doesn't even make sense to do it that way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then a good closing comment here from Satnam on Crowdcast. He makes a comment that most organizations think change management is just about training and communications, when it is much more than that. And I couldn't agree more with that comment. And to address those areas outside of training and communications, you need to get a jump start on this stuff that we're talking about today, which is the operating model and defining what that future state is going to be.
Yeah, because that sets people with, okay, that's why we're doing this, and that then gets them involved. Whereas many times we don't tell anybody until we've gotten to the point, oh, we've got this new system we're going to give you, and it's great. And that's not change management. And putting posters on walls is not change management. So I agree with you there, Sadam.
Right. And so I guess, here's actually a really good closing question for this discussion here today, that I think it sort of, it puts a bow on this whole discussion. And this is from Joost Winnick from the Netherlands. I'm on, I think this is LinkedIn. I have so many things open, I can't remember which platform I'm on here, but I think this is LinkedIn. He said, with all the knowledge in the world, that it is not easy, that these sorts of transformations are not easy at all. why do companies still think that it is? I don't know if you have an answer to that, but I mean, that's a good way to lead it. If you have some thoughts on that.
You've never been involved then in a sales cycle for a vendor, because their whole thing is to take away the concern and make it feel as if, no, this will be a walk in the park because we've got your back. And soon you realize that's not actually the case. And so that's why many times we get caught into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, good. Well, Wayne, thanks a lot for your time. This is a great discussion. The time flew by. I can't believe it's already been over an hour, but this is really good discussion. And I think there's a lot of different directions we could go building on this, but I think this is a good overview of operating models and how that all ties into digital transformation and how it ties into other work streams of a digital or business transformation. So thanks very much for being here today. Appreciate it.
No, it's been great and some great questions, and I've enjoyed this topic. So really good. Thanks for letting me be part of it.
Absolutely. You can definitely sense your energy and enthusiasm for this topic. So I appreciate you being here. All right. Great conversation. Wayne, thanks for being on the show. That was a really interesting set of responses and discussion points. And I really appreciate the people that joined the live stream, which we do every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern time in the United States, or U.S. time. And love to have you join anytime. If you want to be part of the show and ask questions of our guests, feel free to join those live streams on Fridays. And then typically within the next 2 episodes, you'll hear that segment on Transformation Ground Control. So when we come back, we're going to talk more about operating models and business process improvement, all that good stuff. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more.